Okay, I got Dave Weiner back in the studio. We're going to be talking about Protective Future and the future of crisis management, the future of crises that are happening around the world, happening with our businesses. And Dave, this is what you do, among many other things, but this is something you're passionate about. You're certified in it. So let's just jump into it. Let's talk about, first tell me, what do you think the future threats are going to be? And this could be, I'm trying to look out like 3 to 5 years, because any further than that, it gets kind of fuzzy. But what do you think the future threats? I mean, we're in a crisis, right? We've been in a crisis for a while, for the last 20 years, almost 20 years, and I think we still have a little bit more to go. But what do you think the future threats are going to be to our economy and to business?
Well, first and foremost, Scott, thanks for having me on today. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to sit here and trade some good thoughts on a Friday. But my feeling is this: I think the future threats are a lot of the same threats we're dealing with today, to be quite frank. And the reason I say that, and I'll qualify this remark for those out there that are like, wait, what? You're supposed to be giving us this really cool future knowledge. No, I think it's the same threats because I really believe that we have we have industries of people that believe that nothing bad will ever happen to them, right?
Yeah,
which
sure.
is why they fail to prepare on in a lot of ways for a variety of reasons. And the reality is we still have natural disasters, we still have workplace violence, we still have, from a retail perspective, we have robberies, we have all these different types of things. And if your organization isn't prepared on how to appropriately deal with those things, and I think a lot of people, when we talk about threats and risks, we talk about the advent of violence and violence prevention. That's obviously at the top because that happens a lot. However, there's other things that can be disruptive to a business: supply chain disruptions.
We're seeing it now.
Natural work stoppages. Something simple as a power outage can cause a business owner a lot of headache. And I'd also like to point out, because I've had this comment made to me when interacting with folks, especially very small business owners, like when you suggest like preparedness to folks, a lot of people are like, well, I don't understand what you do. Like you're like, I'm a small business owner. I work out of my home, so I don't understand, like, how do your services apply to me? Granted, my services may not be for everybody, but the reality is this: irregardless of what industry you're in, irregardless of how big or small your business is, you should be prepared to deal with the disruptions that come with owning a business, period. It doesn't matter.
We use that crisis terminology, because you just used an interesting term, which is disruption. When we use the crisis, the kind of the security investigations, crisis management folks who come out of military and law enforcement, right, with our experience. So we're used to dealing with a crisis, an emergency, what have you. But do business folks, do you feel like they like that term better, disruption? Is that more palatable to them?
Well, I think it's a better description, right? Because when you start using terms like emergency or crisis, it sort of paints a different picture, in the sense that you're only talking about things like, a crisis, a fire, or an earthquake, or a natural disaster, whereas disruption kind of covers, in my view, a broad brush of
well, like you said, if power goes out on your block, it doesn't mean that there was a crisis, like an earthquake or a hurricane or something. But it also could mean that there was a hurricane or a car crashed into a power pole, and now you've got, now what are you going to do? You quoted some metrics before we got on the air that I want you to try and recall. How many businesses are prepared appropriately, and how many do you think are not, and are subject to really taking a hard hit if some disruption comes to their business?
So the statistics, I will share are not necessarily mine, they're FEMA's. And FEMA estimates that between 40 and 60% of small businesses go out of business, after a natural disaster. So while there's probably a variety of reasons for that, I would also argue that I think in a majority of those cases, there was a lack of preparedness in a variety of ways, right? A variety of ways to prevent loss, to prevent disruption. There weren't redundancies built in to continue business continuity practices, things of that nature. And that's not unusual for small businesses. Why? Because small businesses have a whole lot of other stuff to worry about. They're worried about client acquisition. They're worried about marketing. They're worried about branding. They're worrying about a lot of these other things. But the reality is even as a small business, you should still be building in redundancies to mitigate those disruptions, or to build in redundancies to allow you to continue to operate in the face of a disaster.
Is it your estimation that they should, entrepreneurs, especially I think small businesses, because, businesses under 500 employees make up the majority of the economy in the United States, right? Is it your declaration, really, your passion that entrepreneurs and CEOs and people that are involved in these small businesses should start with resiliency or redundancies in mind as they're building their business?
Well, I think they should be assessing the potential risks. They should be assessing the potential, what could hurt me, right? What are the things as a business owner to my particular business model, whatever that happens to be, because everybody's threats and risks, while in some cases like a natural disaster may be the same, everybody's disruptions may be different depending on the circumstances, right? Let's say you make a widget, and I like this example, and your widget consists of 3 parts. And one of those parts maybe comes out of a place like Louisiana, as an example, where they have a lot of hurricanes and a lot of issues. And that to be true. All of a sudden, there's a hurricane and it wipes out one of your suppliers. What are you doing? And that's a very simplified, example. But the reality is this kind of stuff happens every day. So how are you hedging against that? What are you doing? And the reality is most people are doing what? They're doing crisis management in that moment, trying to figure out what to do in the moment, instead of having a plan to go, okay, if my supplier happens to get disrupted, well, I have a backup supplier over here that can potentially supply me the same thing in a roughly amount of the same time, instead of trying to figure out, oh my gosh, what do I do?
They're reacting rather than being prepared. And okay, we're ready. We were ready for this, so we had a second supplier. We switch over and we keep building the widget. Now, that takes a lot of planning, doesn't it? Isn't this something that you got to hire 10 consultants and pay millions of dollars to get to?
No. The simple answer is no. The simple answer is no. And the reason I say that is because every business is different. Obviously, the bigger your company and the more divisions you have and the more things, things get more complex. And sure, you should probably have somebody, but if you're a much smaller business, you need, if the power goes out, as an example, I use this example all the time because it's an easy example. Your emergency or your continuity plan or whatever can be 4 lines. Hey, when the power goes out, if the power, we call the power company. Do you have an estimated time of restoral, right? Use that as an example. Yeah. Hey, it's going to be restored in 2 hours. Okay, well, anything under 4 hours will still continue to operate the store. Maybe we have, maybe we invest in a generator to hedge against maybe power outages. I don't know.
If you're in an ice cream shop, I'm sure you want a generator. Keep your
But it depends on your business. If you're an ice cream store, sure, that might be a wise investment. What about a bookstore? Maybe not, right? So the reality is you have to look at your business model, and you have to look at the threats and risks and hazards that can impact or disrupt your business, and then you have to put in place those things that are going to potentially mitigate.
So it doesn't have to be elaborate. It could be simple.
No. And you should keep it as simple as possible, because during a disaster, the more simpler it is, the easier it's going to be to remember to do. But even having a little book, hey, if this happens, I'll do this. Understanding the threats, like for instance, understanding the natural hazards in your area, right? You live in Louisiana or Florida, what's your biggest hazard? Hurricanes
Yeah,
usually, right?
hurricanes.
And that's a season.
California, it's earthquakes,
Earthquakes,
right?
right?
Wildfires. Yeah.
If you live in Tornado Alley,
Yeah.
probably tornadoes, right?
Well,
So,
and how does now everybody's working, or a lot of people are working remote, not everybody, but how does remote working play into this? Is there positives and negatives?
well, absolutely, with a dispersed workforce, especially with a dispersed workforce, you have a lot of considerations, right? So the reality is now, instead of having like, okay, well, all my workforce is located in this town, right? I have a warehouse, and this is where all my people are. But now, because of a pandemic, I have a dispersed workforce. I have people working from home. You still have to be cognizant, at least from an accountability standpoint, of,
That's
okay,
right.
I have a dispersed workforce. What happens if there's a hurricane in, where a maybe you have some software engineers or somebody, or some critical part of your business that is dispersed, and now all of a sudden is impacted by a natural disaster. They don't have internet, they don't have this, they don't have that. What is your backup plan if they go offline?
Yeah.
How are you helping provide them resources? You know, we I hear a lot of organizations, and you've heard this over your career too, where, hey, people are our most important resource. Okay,
Yeah.
well,
With
if
duty
that's
of
the
care.
case, yes, then what are you doing, to ensure that those folks are being taken care of, or what type of resources are you prepared to provide, in those particular instances? In some cases, it may not be much, and in some, again, it's going to be very specific to each business, right?
Right.
Because each business has its own unique characteristics. So I always tell people, you can't use a cookie cutter plan. You can't use one of these things downloaded off the internet. You can use it as a guide,
From the FEMA site.
right? Yeah. But you have to look at your own business, and you have to assess the real threats. I mean, how many people live in different areas and don't necessarily always know what the hazards are,
Hmm. Well,
right?
I mean, if you live there, yeah. But I mean, to your point, if you have a kind of a dispersed workforce, anyways, you've got manufacturing in another state, maybe there isn't some awareness of like, oh, like I didn't know Austin, Texas gets ice storms. I had no
Hmm.
idea until the power
Yeah.
went out one day at one of our businesses. So now, who do you think is kind of what size companies are most vulnerable in your estimation?
Well,
Is there a
I mean,
size? That might be an unfair question, but I mean,
I
what do you think?
I don't think it's a size issue.
Hmm.
In the context of, I think there's you know, some organizations, have a great culture of preparedness, um, because of maybe they've already had some experiences that have caused us to go, ooh, we need to do this. Usually, get or why organizations all of a sudden launch into some preparedness and, around business disruptions, is because something happened,
It's a
right?
reaction too, right?
Well, it's being reactive rather than proactive.
Yeah.
I would ask, like, how many businesses, how many organizations have actually gone to their city or state or their county and actually looked at the hazard vulnerability assessment that the county and state put out?
Right.
How many people have actually done that, right? Probably not many. So you
Or
don't
pulled
really
comp
know if
stats or
yeah,
looked
and
at
that
crime
has a wealth
statistics.
of knowledge. That has a
Right.
wealth of knowledge as to the type of risks and hazards that can confront your organization. But if your business is multi-state, well, then you should know in each state what hazards, and each facility essentially is going to have its own playbook,
Oh.
right?
One thing that I always talk about is how the world's getting smaller because technology has connected us around the world. And there's no reason why now I can't pull up my technology and look at news that's happening in Africa or South America or Central Asia or Russia or my own backyard, and I get immediate information, immediate feeds. So therefore, I think the world's getting smaller, and because of that, we're much more comfortable, I think, doing business in many parts of the world, which is good. I think these are all good things. But it brings additional risk, doesn't it? And if we are going to do business, we are going to have supply chains that are kind of, maybe all over the place. Maybe we manufacture now in Mexico where 5 years ago we never would consider manufacturing in Mexico. But we feel good enough about it. With certain assurances are in place. And maybe we manufacture something in the United States now because we feel better about it. There's certain assurances that are in place, and we have good margins, right? Shorter transportation, perhaps, whatever. So as far as where the risks are going, and how the future threats, you say more of the same, and I don't disagree with you. But how can these businesses be ready for more of the same if they aren't ready for the same today? And the reason why I say that is because we're always fighting the battle of yesterday or the war of yesterday. Even the U.S. government does this. To some extent, they've got divisions that don't do this, and are prepared for future conflict. But why do we keep fighting the battles of yesterday and we aren't prepared for tomorrow? Why do you think that is? And then when I say we, I mean, the royal we, as the dude would say, we as in business owners and we as in the economy. Why do you think that is?
So before I touch upon that, you said something interesting about the world getting smaller because we have access to a lot of information, right? Because we get information sources from all over the place. I think the first part of that, though, is always is trust but verify, because we all know that there's a lot of information out there that isn't necessarily true or correct, and that's the reality. And the reason we fight a lot of battles from yesterday is because I think that we're so eager to get past the bad times, we like to forget about the past. We want to pretend that didn't happen. And we want everything to be, great, which is great, but that's not reality in my view, right? So I think we need to start learning from the past, and we need to start applying a lot of those lessons to our future activities in order to be prepared against business disruptions. It's very interesting to me how many calls I've gotten recently regarding like workplace violence prevention. We've been talking about this for decades, mass shootings and things like that, yet you still have organizations that have no policies, no procedures. They've never trained anybody on any of these things, which I find very, very interesting.
Yeah, but by the way, you're required by Cal OSHA to have those things, especially if you're in healthcare.
Yeah, and exactly. But the reality is that it really goes back to the belief. Well, that can't happen here. We started this. Me and my buddies, we started this small software company, and we're good to go. And everybody here's family, and we're friends. Okay, yeah, until one of those folks isn't doing what they're supposed to, and all of a sudden they're getting cut out of this, role or position or job, and now all of a sudden they're faced with losing their livelihood.
Yeah.
Now everything takes a different tone, right? Now all of a sudden you're calling security professionals to figure out, hey, this dude showed up with a gun or something happened, and now you're trying to play catch up at that point instead of
you never want to
react. Procedures to follow.
Always behind the power curve when you're reacting. It's
100%.
It's like baseball's on right now, right? And so you don't necessarily know what kind of pitch that pitcher's going to throw, And so hopefully, unless they're cheating, the batter doesn't necessarily know what's coming his way.
Right.
And so that's where I see a lot of our economy is reacting to, okay, there's the ball. And do you swing where the ball is when you first see it? No. You swing where you think the ball's going to be, and hopefully you connect and you hit a home
Well,
run, which is what we want business owners to do.
well, and to take your analogy further, um, those players, what do in order to get ready for that home run? They
Prepare.
practice and they
Yeah.
prepare.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. A
so
lot.
the reality is that, and as I shared with you before, I really believe that, continuity, and preparedness are inextricably linked, in a lot of different ways. In order to ensure that you're resilient against disruptions and hazards and the threats that exist, you need to prepare for them, bottom line.
So we
So,
kind of talked about people, like the CEOs, and how they can be better prepared to be thinking about these things, the future threats. We've talked a little bit about processes. The process can be simple or it can be complex. It really depends on your business and how you want to kind of mitigate those risks. Let's talk about technology, though. Do you use technology today, or have you used technology in the past in preparedness or mitigation, or what? Let's talk a little bit about technology. Does it play a role in what you do, or maybe what these folks can do to make themselves more resilient?
I think it can absolutely, and obviously there's a whole host of preparedness apps out there that people can download. Some are gamified. There's things like Harbor,
Hmm.
or FEMA has an app. There's a lot of
Oh,
different things out there. When you're talking about technology, the one of the biggest pieces of technology I would think is like mass notification, right?
okay,
Emergency
good. Let's
notification
talk about
systems,
that.
right?
Okay.
So depending on how large or small your organization is, is this, communication is key, right?
Yeah.
Communication is key for a variety of reasons. So if you have operations spread out all over the place, how are you communicating with people, especially during an emergency? Some people choose to use, mass notifications like Nixle or Everbridge, or, some of the live process, like some of the other, different systems that are out there, which is good. And it's good if you have a large organization because you're able to push out informations rather quickly. But you also have to make sure you have a process for sending out messages, who sends them, what is the message, do you have a diverse population? Like, as an example, if you have a university that has international students, are those
Yeah.
emergency messages going out in their respective languages? Like, there's a lot of
Great point.
considerations.
Yeah.
So,
And what do they put in the message? They just put
well,
anything, or do they call? They just say, "Hey, dial 911 if you have an emergency." What do these messages say?
so, typically the messages, for instance, when you're looking at something like higher education, right, you have requirements from Department of Ed for timely warnings, which
Mm.
means that let's say the police are, chasing, a bad guy through the campus, and all of a sudden he barricades himself and he's, threatening to shoot up the place. And I'm just using this as a very random example, but that would be a time where you could push out, or you should push out an information to have your, community locked down, right? Hey, lock down. There's police activity.
Shelter in place.
Um, and what's interesting is things. I've seen agencies use Twitter, as an example, to push out, notifications. Why? Because not everybody's going to download that emergency,
That's right.
app through the city, but everybody's got Twitter.
That's
So,
right.
agencies have been using social media as a way to connect with people. As an example, Facebook has that feature where you can check in if something's happened in your area, right? So
Good
even
point.
the social media companies have kind of tied in a little bit to the kind of preparedness, or like, hey, check in and let your family know you're doing okay. There was an earthquake here in California, and your grandma on the East Coast wants to know you're doing okay, and she happens to be on Facebook, and you can let her know through the app, right?
It seems like to me, having been like you in a number of disaster zones, one thing that even though we didn't have smartphones when I was at Katrina, doing relief and stuff and junk, we couldn't use our cell phones, but we could text. And now this was the old, we had Nextels and flip phones, and we were texting kind of the gibberish language, but text messages would go through, and I think that's still probably something. And so having those mass notifications that come in a bunch of different ways, I think is really important, especially to your point during a natural disaster. Where you might not have all the cell service and data that you could ever want, because the lines get flooded. Because to your point, Grandma on the East Coast wants to make sure you're okay, and she's calling you, and she's tying up a actual physical phone line, and I don't think a lot of people realize that. And so should all companies have that consideration of some type of mass notification or notification?
Well, I think they need to have the ability to have some level of redundant communication. And again, it's really going to depend on your business model, what you're doing, what's the criticality of losing communication for a little bit. Like, obviously that's not good. But what's that process? I know in some organizations that I work for, even in the private sector, we had sat phones, right? So if the cell systems go down, you still have the ability to communicate. How critical is that for your organization to have some level of redundant communications? I think there's a lot of great infrastructure out there. So, but if we experience the big, 8.0 earthquake, that's supposed to, make California, Arizona beachfront property, I think that, a lot of that infrastructure, at least locally, is going to disappear, right?
Yeah.
So how are we communicating at that point? Like in worst case scenarios, and that's the other thing I like to point out. I think that also plays a role in people's level of preparedness, right? So we're talking about low frequency but very high consequence events, but they're incredibly low frequency. So I think there's also this mode of, well, they never really happen, right? And the times they have happened, they haven't been too bad, so I think we're going to be okay, right?
Well, and let's talk about that for a second, because I think you're nailing it, low frequency, and so let's take California, specifically Southern California, where you and I have ties. The Northridge earthquake was in '94 or something like that. And, this, at least for a big earthquake, Southern California is long overdue, right?
Well, absolutely. And, the people forget, like, overpasses collapsed, Yeah.
When trucks run into them in Washington, D.C., sure.
Yeah.
Sorry, that just happened. If you didn't know that.
Yeah. There was a lot of infrastructure damage in the '94 earthquake.
There was. Tremendous.
Yeah.
And fire, police, and medical cannot get to you. They are not coming. That's what I want people to know. They will not come because they can't get to you.
And that's what I tell people. They're going to prioritize, right? They're going to prioritize the most severe things they're dealing with, and that's usually going to be fires and things that could spread. And telling people, listen, in a disaster like that, you better be prepared to hunker down for at least a week.
Is that what the recommendation is, even with a business, like to stay resilient? I mean, what are you talking to them about, specifically earthquakes? Because I think that's probably one of the most dangerous, unfrequent occurrence, right?
Obviously, what you tell people is that first and foremost, you got to take care of yourself, right? Yeah. You have to make sure that you're good. There's, you have the ability to address, injuries and things of that nature. You should have food, you should have water, sustenance and those type of things, and obviously in that immediate moment, obviously everything takes a backseat to your safety. I mean, that's the reality. But after you get to the point where you're like, okay, I'm okay, my family's okay, there's, there's some damage to the house, I may have to address these things. small businesses live on very small margins, right?
Yeah.
So how do you keep the money flowing in so you can continue your livelihood is really because you're going to have a whole lot of things that are going to come on the back end of this. What is what does your insurance look like?
That's right.
You know, what are your insurance plans? What does it cover? Have you reviewed your plan? What is the extent of the damages it will actually cover? We all know that insurance policies and other things are filled with legalese, and a lot of stuff, and a lot of people don't always read all of it. So I always caution people, like, read the fine print to make
Yeah.
sure that your policy is going to cover the things that you're going to need to make yourself quote whole again
Yeah.
in order to do that. But again, developing plans and acquiring supplies and things like that doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be this huge complicated thing. Even as a small business, if you have 5 people, you don't need a 300-page emergency operations plan. Like, I think that's the other thing. Like, people think, wow, this is a lot of work. I don't know. You don't need all that. But you need to understand the threats, risks, business disruptions, and the things that could potentially hinder you or hurt you, and then what types of things do you put in place
So
in order to
what we're really
mitigate that?
talking about here is future-proofing businesses
Hmm.
from disruption.
Hmm.
I mean, to boil it
Yeah,
down, I think that's
yeah,
what you're nailing for me is that if businesses want to continue to be successful in the future, they've got to plan now, today. And when you have bandwidth, I think your point is that's when you should be looking at these things. Look at the region, look at the area
yeah,
that you operate in, look at the area where your customers are, especially if you have an online business. Where could you
yeah,
have disruption there? Look at your supply chains, looking at your warehousing, look at your products and services. How could they be impacted?
yeah.
What do you think is, this is kind of, we didn't talk about this beforehand, but what do you think the businesses that are current now, and this could be an industry, it could be a business, that won't be in business in the next 5 years? Is there something that comes top of mind because that you've seen that's just not ready for the coming disasters? That we and not the one that we're in. I mean, we're still in a pandemic. People need to remember that. Yeah, I know everybody's got the COVID shot and we're almost pretty much wide open. But what industry do you think is going to really suffer on the tail end? Because there's always a tail, right? Coming out of
Yeah.
disaster, there's always a long tail where you just might not make it as a business.
I, I think to characterize it wholly is I think the businesses that aren't going to make it are the ones that don't prepare, and
They're
that's
just
really
not. They
the
have no
bottom line.
nothing. Yeah, no matter
I,
what industry.
because each disaster or each disruption has a very different impact, right? If you look at the pandemic, what did that really hit? It really hit service related businesses, things that required like restaurants, and massage places, or, things that required like physical personal contact. A lot of those got hit very, very hard because
Yeah.
that was the nature of this particular disaster. In another disaster, it could be anything, right? So I think I don't think any one business or any one business industry is immune to disruptions. Everybody's vulnerable, but
Hmm.
it's not about being vulnerable. It's about being like, okay, what can we do about it? Understanding the risk and then being able to address it. And some ways you're going to have to mitigate it. You're not going to be able to prevent it in some cases. In some cases you'll be able to mitigate it. I think something like the pandemic forced a lot of organizations to pivot,
Yeah,
right? Which is a good thing,
I agree.
right? So some organizations were like, okay, we're put on the spot right now. Now what do we do? Okay, here's what we're going to do. And they made a decision. And in some cases, I'll use a real classic example because this comes up all the time. And you brought it up earlier is the work from home, your dispersed
Yeah.
workforce. You've had traditionally some organizations that were flat against nobody's ever working from home. We're going to the office every
That's
day,
right.
right? And they never had a plan for work from home because they're like, well, we're never going to need that. We're never going to do that. without really thinking like, okay, well, what happens if, then you had some organizations who were considering it and sort of started developing out, well, I don't know, this could be a good, but it wasn't in the vein of preventing against or like preparing for disasters. It was more of like the quality of life, right? The work-life balance we always hear about, that I'm not sure exists, right?
Yeah, it's true.
Right?
Not
In
for
our world,
entrepreneurs
where's
like
that?
us.
So, and then you had some organizations, and a lot of the tech companies were probably very prepared because they actually have been dealing with a dispersed workforce because they've actually had a lot of people working from home.
That's right.
Um, and now some companies have come out and said, yeah, we're going to work from home forever. We're going to get rid of
That's
our
right.
infrastructure, right?
Right.
But when you do that, okay, well, here's what I'd say. You asked me what industries could be impacted.
Okay.
So
Good.
I would say, well, think of it this way. So you have an organization that rents an office building, right? And you have a bunch of supportive services, restaurants, cleaning, janitorial services, coffee carts, and all these other things. Well, when that big tower, they decide to, oh, we're just going to work from home. Well, all those little small businesses that were now dependent on that office being open,
Right.
unless they have a plan or unless they have multiple clients or unless they're doing multiple buildings, they're going to be hit hardest. I mean, there's what, 32 million small businesses in the United States,
That's a great point.
which is a lot. But at the same time, it's like when a bigger organization goes by the wayside, hey, that office building no longer needs, physical security, right? It no longer needs security guards. It doesn't need janitorial. It doesn't need the barista. It doesn't need all these supportive things. So now you're having a somewhat of an impact on the economy when
It's a
everybody
trickle
decides, hey,
down.
we're going to work. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think even those small businesses, if they're not prepared to kind of deal with like, okay, what happens if this goes away? What do I do? Right?
Yeah.
You wanna prepare. You wanna make sure like, okay, well, I'm gonna have this client and this client and this client, multiple streams of income to make sure that if one shuts off for whatever reason due to a disaster or whatever, at least you have another one coming in.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. I'll leave you the last question, I think a lot of people who have businesses are going to ask this, but why should they look for an expert to tell them or to help them with this, with preparedness and with disruption? Why can't they just download the forms from the FEMA website and they just like fill out the form?
Well, they absolutely can. There's nothing that says they can't do that, right?
What are
They
they going to get
absolutely
out of
can.
that though?
I think what it really boils down to, is complexity. What is the complexity of your business? I think that's really the driver of whether you need to bring somebody in. If you're a single person LLC and you're working from home, you can kind of figure out probably what's best for you, right?
Right.
That doesn't mean you couldn't call somebody and consult with them. That's not what I'm saying. But I think it really depends on the complexity of your business. Do you have multi-states? Do you have a very specific like supply chain that is kind of, complicated? Like again, complexity is really what drives that. And I think that but I think more so is people need to believe that
Hmm.
something bad can happen. And since the bad thing can happen, well, how do I protect myself against it? Sometimes you can help somebody with a half-hour phone call, right? Even as a consultant, you can still help somebody with a half-hour phone call. Or sometimes, again, depending on the complexity, well, then we need to make this a formal engagement, right? This isn't going to be something I'm going to be able to help you solve in a half hour. But I think it really focuses on the belief and then taking action to make sure that you're future proofing your business.
Hmm. And how can they get a hold of you if they want to future-proof their business?
So you can go to my website, www.secure-measures.com, or I can be reached by phone, 310-507-1493.
Awesome.
Just give me a call.
Reach out.
Happy to chat.
Yeah, we both have had a lot of previous experience together during disasters, and
Yes.
I can tell the audience confidently that you can do no better than Dave. I've seen you operate, and you've told me some pretty hairy stories of full campuses going into the dark, and you worked to solve those problems and keep that hospital running. So you've been there on the client side. Now you're on the consultant side. You're definitely a value to businesses. So with that, what we talk about here is the future and protecting, and how we're going to protect it, how we're going to make you future-proof as a person in your process and with technology across all the boards. And thank you for following us. Make sure you're sharing this as much as possible with people who need to understand what the future risks and threats are going to be. And subscribe to the channel. That always helps. And liking this gets the ratings up as well, because we want to get as many people on board with being ready for what the future is going to hold. The crisis is not going away. It's only getting worse. So let's all be prepared together. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it.